Already have noticed this if you look up near the top of the screen here where it says NYMEM2. This is a server that I have not used for any of the other demonstrations so far up to this point in this course. And the reason I wanted to bring up a new member server here is because, well, New York member 1 was starting to get a little bit cluttered with different features and functionality. And also I've noticed that the file server resource manager, if you have too many different file server functions and too many, really I should say, advanced networking services type functionality running, it does tend to get a little bit finicky. And I didn't want to run into those problems, and so I thought I would also share with you so that if you're following along, that you may also want to get yourself onto a clean copy of Windows Server 2012. Now, I will also share with you, because I don't want you to think to yourself going into a production environment that you have to have a perfectly clean server to start this. That's not the case at all. The File Server Resource Manager will work on pretty much, I've actually, other than the demonstration, testing, classroom type environment, outside of that, I've never had the FSRM not work for me. It's just that I've learned that in this type of testing, demo classroom-like environment, it does get a little finicky because we're kind of forcing these computers to do things that you wouldn't normally do in a production environment because we're just trying to touch everything. Okay, so just to clarify, I'm on a clean machine. I recommend that you do as well for learning purposes, but in production, it is not necessary at all. So here on NYMEM2, and I suppose I should add to it, if it's not obvious, this server, all I've done with it so far is I've installed Windows Server 2012 and I've joined it to the globalmantics.local domain, okay, therefore making it a member server in the domain. Other than that, there's really nothing else that I've done. If we want to install the File Server Resource Manager, well, this is what's called a role service. Okay, so just like with any other role or feature, it has to be installed or should be installed through Server Manager. So I'm going to open that now. And the reason that I emphasize that it is a role service, and we'll see here in just a moment when I go ahead and add it into the system when we go to install it, is that you won't see it listed under roles, nor will you see it listed under features. Okay, you're going to have to dig down into one of the roles to see the role service. So let's do that right now. I'm going to click on Add Roles and Features. Here's our typical before you begin page. I'm going to actually say don't bother me with that anymore. Right? We always see that when we first install a server, just letting us know, hey, there's certain things you should always do to a server before you install the role. I'll click Next. It's going to be a role-based installation, so I'll click Next. It's going to be on NYMEM2, so I can click Next. And then this is where, like I said, it can get confusing if you don't know where you're going. I won't see the File Server Resource Manager anywhere here, right? Because if we look alphabetically, it would fall somewhere right in here, right around File and Storage Services. If I were to click Next and jump to My Features, alphabetically, again, you'd see it right around here, and you don't. So if I click Previous, or by the way, you can also always click up top here on the left, just jump right back to the area you want to get back to. Under Server Roles, we want to expand, so click this little arrow next to File and Storage Services. Even if they were not installed, you would still want to click the arrow to expand them. And then here under File and iSCSI Services, you want to expand it again. If I scroll down a little bit, this is where I have my File Server Resource Manager. Okay? That's where you find it. So I'm going to check the box, and as usual, it's going to tell me, hey, you need some other stuff in order to make this work. Okay, so it's telling me that I have to be a file server as well. And then, of course, it's going to want to put in the actual tool, right? The actual GUI tool in order to use this particular, well, to use the tool. So let me go ahead and click Add Features, right? Say, yep, go ahead and add those in. I'll click Next. Those features have already been added. I don't need any additional features, so I'll click Next. Here's a summary of what's going to take place, and I will click Install. So it's going to go through and it's going to install the various role services and features that we've just asked it to. As is usually the case, depending on the speed of the computer that you're working on, this could take a longer or shorter period of time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and through the magic of video editing, I'm going to go ahead and speed this up for you. If you're following along, please pause at this point and then resume when the installation has completed. Okay, so the bar has gone all the way across the screen, and as you can see here, it says installation has succeeded. So I will close this window. And then the next thing we need to do is come up to our Tools menu, where we will now see the File Server Resource Manager. So let's jump over there. And you'll notice that when you look at this particular tool, we have 5 areas, and they happen to match, I think, perfectly with the 5 areas that I had listed on the screen before we jumped over to the operating system, in the sense that we have quota management, file screening management, storage report management, classification management, and file management tasks. So we will look at each of those 5 areas, and that's pretty much, as you can see, everything there is to the File Server Resource Manager. But before I get to those 5 tasks, on the actual tool itself, on the actual File Server Resource Manager, I could right-click and select to configure options. Well, actually, before I even do that, I'll tell you, I could connect to another computer. So as you can see here, FSRM is designed for remote management, as is most things in Windows Server 2012, as is the case with most things in Windows Server 2012. I don't have FSRM installed on any other computer, so we're obviously going to work on this computer right here. But I also could configure options. Before I select this, I also want to show you, let me click away, we also have these abilities right over here in the Actions pane. So if I click on Configure Options, here we get a kind of a generic set of default options as far as how the server should act as a whole. Okay, so just to kind of go through these tabs very quickly, here are email notifications, so you can tell it what SMTP server it should be using when trying to send out an email notification, because we will see with the various tasks, part of managing these tasks is to send out an email to administrators, right? Send out an email to yourself, making yourself aware that a certain activity is taking place on your file server. We can also put in default recipients of who are these administrators and who we want the email to say it's from. And now I don't have any email server set up in my environment, so I can't fill any of this in. And if I did, I could also at this point do a test email. Right? I might as well find out right here, right now, hey, does this work? Right? There's no point in going in and configuring everything else and thinking that we're golden if these emails are all just going to go into Never Never Land or are going to produce errors or whatever the case might be. So this is a great place to test whether the email notifications work. Now this next tab is kind of cool. This is where you can set up some notification limits, which basically says for each of these types of notifications, whether it's an email that's going out to the administrators, an event log that's being made, a command that's being run, or a report that's being added to or generated. Here is where we can put in a period of time that the system will wait in between notifications. And you'll notice the default, it's always in minutes, so it's 1 hour, right? 60 minutes or 1 hour for each one of these. And the idea here is that very often when you have something on a file server that has become a problem, right? Somebody has exceeded their quota. Something is just, a drive is getting full to the extent that you need to be notified. Well, these are the types of things that once that's happened, it kind of stays in that state. And if we were sending out notifications, let's say once every minute, right? Let's say we only waited 1 minute in between notifications. Well, then suddenly you, the administrator, are going to be quite upset when your email box is getting a new email once every minute. Right? Once a minute you're getting, boom, average Joe user has exceeded their quota. A minute later, same user exceeded their quota. A minute later, same user has exceeded their quota. And so on and so forth. You get the idea. You don't want to clutter your email inbox, your event logs, and things like that with all these notifications. So the default is 1 hour. You can change that to a shorter or longer period of time, but the idea is this way you will get an email, and even though that user may still be over their quota limit, you won't be bothered again for another hour. And that's kind of nice, especially if this were, let's say you were managing a global environment and you had a user that was on the other side of the planet who had now exceeded their quota, and the time where they did it may have been a normal business hour, but where you're at, it's, let's say, 1 in the morning and you're sleeping. And this is not the type of notification that you necessarily need to know about instantaneously, right? It's not something that means you got to wake up and go into the office. It's just something you need to address the next day. Well, if we were allowing these notifications to go out once a minute, imagine how many emails you have in your inbox when you wake up the next morning if this problem started at 1 a.m. Even with the 1 hour separation, you're going to end up with what? Depending on what time you get up and check your email for the first time in the morning, you might have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 emails already telling you that you have a problem, even with 1 hour in between emails. Okay, so that's what this is about here. Now, the Storage Reports tab, this is just the default parameters for some of the various storage reports. We'll talk a little bit about storage reports when we get into storage report management. And then, you'll also see, by the way, that some of these tabs we come back to as a part of managing individually with these particular areas of management. What I will tell you is probably more often viewed than this particular tab, although this is a great way to just kind of review these reports real quick. Right? You can just kind of take a look at a quick review of the report. The one thing that is looked at probably more often would be the next tab, which is the report locations. This, and when I say looked at, I mean as in you may want to do something with it. Depending on the frequency that your storage reports are being created, you may want to move those reports to a different disk. Okay, in other words, performance reasons that we've seen in many different areas of the operating system. If we know that typically in a database, if we know that the database and log files should be separated onto different disks so that we can be reading and writing from both at the same time. Same thing here. If we have too many of these reports being written, well, then we may not want to put them on our C drive with our operating system because that will slow down the operating system. We may want to have some other location, some other disk. And again, I want to emphasize a different disk, not a different partition. Doing another partition would actually be worse. Okay, and I know partition is kind of the old term. It's called volume now. But either way, you don't want to be a different volume or partition on the same disk. You want to be a truly separate disk for performance reasons. Now, the next tab we have up here, File Screen Audit. This is a simple one. One simple checkbox. Do we want to do file screen auditing? Okay, do we want to have an auditing database of when users are trying to save things that fall under file screening, meaning they get blocked by file screening? If we want to enable that, it's a simple check of the box. Automatic classification. This is another example of, this is a tab actually that we will be brought right back to when we get into the classification management. Okay, so classifications, we haven't really talked about what they are yet, so I'm going to leave this tab alone for right now and just tell you that once we establish what that is, this is just basically where you can set up a schedule for automatic classification of files based upon the classification rules that we're going to put in place. And the one last tab we have here, it's called Access Denied Assistance. This is, I like this. This is kind of cool, right? Because typically, in a typical network environment, a user goes to access a file or a folder. And again, if we put all this stuff that we're going to talk about here today, we put that aside and we talk just about permissions, right? Just generic file servers, and we have permissions, and a user goes to access a file or folder and they don't have access to it, they just get a very generic access denied message. Well, if we happen to be giving them a denial of access based upon whatever the reasoning may be going on here in the File Server Resource Manager, we can go ahead and create an actual customized message. Okay, so if somebody is denied access to a file or a folder, right now this is the default message that this system will put in, right? The user will actually see a message that doesn't just say access denied. It'll say this can occur if you don't have permission to access a file or folder, or if your computer doesn't meet certain security policy requirements. And then it goes on to, say message from the administrator of the file server, ask your manager if you have the right security groups, and for troubleshooting, go to a certain website. If you need more help, click request assistance. Now you have the ability to put in anything you want. I mean, I could add to this and say, here is additional information. Okay, so I can actually type in my own message, and I don't have to add to it, right? I mean, I could literally go in here and I could change this. This is all changeable information. If I don't want to have this line that says if you need more help, I just hit delete. Okay, it's gone. By the way, if you're wondering how that line just showed back up again, I hit Control-Z on the keyboard, which if you've ever worked with pretty much any Office tool whatsoever, Control-Z stands for undo. So it's interesting to note that even though, and you don't see this very often, but even though we're in a dialog box here, right, we're in the property sheet and then a dialog box, Control-Z doesn't always work in those environments, but it does here. Okay, so I could hit Control-Z again, and look at that. Now it got rid of the line that I typed in. Pretty cool, huh? So that's pretty much the overall options. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. I don't think there was anything that we specifically changed or set up there. But let's take a look at quota management. So let me expand this out. And you'll see here that under quota management, we have quotas and quota templates. Now, real quick, before we get into our quotas here, what I'd like to do is I'm going to minimize this particular tool. I'm going to minimize this File Server Resource Manager. We can actually close out of our Server Manager altogether. I'm going to hit Start on my keyboard to get into the Start screen, and I'm going to go into my computer here. On the computer, I'm going to go into the C drive, and I'm going to create a new folder, and we're just going to call this Documents. Okay, that doesn't matter, by the way. I'm just coming up with a name to put it on. So here I have a folder, and if I go into the properties of the folder, I just wanted you to take a look here and see. Do you see here anything on quotas? Right? We have general. We can share it if we want. We can do our NTFS security. We have previous versions for volume shadow copies. Here we have some additional customization, which not even going to go there. Look, you can change the icon, stuff like that. And then here we have classification, which again, this has a lot to do with the classification that we're going to look at, but then also dynamic access control. The main point here, why I wanted to show you these tabs, is there is a tab that's not there, and that is a tab called quotas, because you do find those quotas when you go to the properties of an actual volume, right? So if I take my C drive and go to its properties, here I have a quota tab. This is how I can do individualized quota management on individual volumes. Okay, this is where I can turn on quota management. I can choose whether I want to deny disk space if a user exceeds their quota limit. Okay, and we're going to see in FSRM that this is called either a hard or soft quota management. In other words, if I check the box, that's hard quota management. Okay, that's where we're saying if you exceed your quota limit, you're done. You're cut off. It's over. You cannot save anything else. If I do not check the box, then what happens is it's strictly for reporting purposes. The user will get an error message saying, hey, you've exceeded your quota, but it'll let them save whatever it is that they're trying to save. You have to decide based upon your environment whether you want to have hard or soft quotas. From there, here's the default quota limit for new users on this volume. Okay, the default could be not to limit disk usage, which means we're only going to have individual quotas for individuals, users, and groups. Or you could say there's a default to say, no, I want to, by default, say that each user, for instance, can only store 100 megabytes worth of data on this particular volume. You can set a warning level that says, how about at 90 megabytes, I'll start telling them, hey, you know, you're getting close. You're almost out of space. And I can choose whether I want to log an event when they reach their warning and or when they exceed their actual quota limit. We have quota entries, which is where we can go in and create individual quota entries, and this is where we can pick specific users and groups and assign, I'm not going to do it here, but that's where you can assign those individual quotas that I was referring to, right? I mentioned that if you say the default is do not limit this usage, you could just do individual ones. Well, you would do that through your quota entries. Okay, so this is how we would set up quotas on an individual volume. And you'll notice it says you should enable the quota system only if you intend to use quotas on this disk volume. When you enable it, the volume will be rescanned to update disk usage statistics. It might take several minutes. Okay, so the idea here is it's going to go through, and let me hit cancel for 1 second here. Let me enable this again. Let me go to quota entries. Right here, what will happen is once I go through and say yes, it will evaluate who owns, right, who's the owner of each file and folder on this particular volume, and it will then list everybody here and say how much they've used, what their particular limit should be, what their warning level is, and what percentage has been used. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and click OK, and I'll say sure, go ahead and do that. All right, so that's quotas on an individual volume. Now, let's jump back over to our File Server Resource Manager. It's in this location that I can take my quotas here, and I can right-click and say, I want to go ahead and create a quota. And then here is where you can set a quota path. So I click Browse, and you'll notice that I could just click on my C drive and click OK, and then that would be my path, right, that for that volume. But check this out. I can browse further down and go to that Documents folder. And now I'm putting a quota on the folder itself. So if you have a shared folder out there, you could put the quota on that folder. Here, we can choose to create the quota on the path itself, or we can auto-apply the template and create quotas on existing and new subfolders within that path. Okay, so you have to decide, do we want it to be just on this particular path, or do we want to dig down through the hierarchy? Here we have our quota properties, okay, and so here you have a choice. Do we want to derive these properties from a template, which is, you'll see here they say recommended, or do I want it to go in and do custom quota properties? Well, in order to understand this, let me cancel out of here, and let's jump over into quota templates. You'll see here that we have a number of built-in templates, right? And you'll notice that we have 4 of them that are hard and 2 of them that are soft. You'll also notice that this says 100 meg limit, 200 meg limit, and also reports to the user 200 meg limit with a 50 megabyte extension or a 250 megabyte extended limit. Okay, so basically it's just showing what those actual limits are, whereas these are only called monitor. And they also show those limits, but because they're soft, we're just monitoring. We're not actually going to cut them off, we're just going to monitor. If I don't like any of these particular limits, okay, let's say I wanted to do a 500 megabyte limit for each of my users. Well, then I could right click on my quota templates, or of course I could also click over here on the right. Either way, create a quota template. And this is where, first of all, I can use a particular template as a starting point, which is kind of cool, right? So let's say I took my 250 megabyte template and said copy. That's just going to put all of those settings in place, and then I can modify from there. We're going to call this one 500 megabyte limit. From there, you'll notice the space limit. I'm not going to make it 250. I'm going to make it 500. I can choose, do I want this to be hard or soft? Do I want to cut the users off at 500 meg, or do I just want to have it send reports to me when a user has crossed that particular limit? Okay, so we'll say a hard quota. That's a large amount, so we'll say, no, you're cut off if you actually get to there. And then from there, we have certain what's called notification thresholds. This is where we can go through, and you'll see here that when they get to 85% of that 500, an email will go out. When they get to 95%, an email goes out and an event log entry gets made. And if they hit their full 100%, again, an email and an event log go out. Now if I click on add, let's create our own. We could pick a percentage. Okay, so this is where you assign whatever percentage you want. So we could send an email to the following administrators, right? You can pick what administrators you're going to notify via email that you've exceeded the certain percentage of the limit. You could also choose to actually send an email to the user themselves. Okay, notify that user via an email saying, "Hey, you know you're past your certain level of quota, so you might want to start cleaning out your stuff." And then you have the actual subject and message that you want to be as part of that email. Now I'm going to again uncheck these boxes because I don't have any of the email functionality set up on this particular server or in my network environment. You can choose about the event log entries. Do you want to send that warning to the event log? And again, talks about what to put into the actual entry. You can actually run a command. Okay, so if you have a command or a script, the one in particular that I've heard used, and I'll tell you I've heard of it, I've not used it myself personally, is one that maybe does a component of auto archiving, so to speak. Right? Somebody gets up to a certain threshold. What it does is it goes through and it looks, and if anything that it sees that's beyond a certain date, based on how old it is, it takes that and archives it to another storage location so as to free up some space. That's something you could do. And then on the report tab, this is where you can also then generate, and again, this should look familiar from when we looked at the options. Right? If we say generate reports, here we have the various reports that we saw out on our original file server resource manager options tab. Once we create those reports, we can also then send those reports via email to administrators and or even the users themselves. I don't know that I would send them to the users, but that is something you could do. It also tells you that this is where they will be saved. Okay, on my C drive there is a folder called Storage Reports Incident. All right, so I'm going to cancel out of that. But basically, if we just leave the defaults here, just like we had, right? We changed for 500, we put in the different warning emails and event logs, click OK. Now I've created my own new quota template, which means up here on quotas, I have the ability to go ahead and create a quota, go to a particular location. I can say for this particular, documents folder, which I didn't share. Typically, you would have shared this. This would be a shared folder that users would access from away from this computer, right? They'd access it across the network. Say go ahead and create the quota on the path, and let's use my 500 meg limit. Down here it gives you a little summary of what you've just done. Click create. Boom. Users will now be limited to 500 megabytes of storage in that particular folder. Pretty cool, huh? If I close that up, let's move on to the next one here, file screening management. The idea here, again, is being able to look for certain types of files and not allowing them to be saved or stored in a particular location. All right, so here we have our file screens, which it's interesting. I almost kind of have to go through this backwards, right? Because if I were to show you creating a new file screen, okay, first of all, it wants the path. So again, I would say in my documents folder, how do you want to configure the file screen properties? What file screen template do you want to use? Okay, well, in order to understand these templates, we have to, let me cancel out of here, we need to go to the file screen templates section. You will see that there are certain built-in templates. If we wanted to create one of our own, we could go ahead and create a new file screen template. We'll just call this demo. I'm not even going to actually save it, but It's not. It's going to get mad at me if I don't fill in certain things here. Again, I can choose if I want active or passive screening. And this is kind of like the hard quota or the soft quota limit, right? Active screening means do not allow users to save the unauthorized files. Passive screening means go ahead and let them save it, but you're going to be notified. It'll be part of the monitoring. From there, we can then select a file group that we want to block. Oh, wait a minute. I can't really explain what that is. Let me cancel out of here without going to file groups. Okay, that's why I said we almost kind of need to look from the bottom up. I just wanted you to understand why. You look at the file groups, this is where you can set up the various file groups that represent certain types of files. So you'll notice for the very top one here, audio and video files, star dot, and if I hover over it, you'll notice the list goes, you see the little ellipses here, the dot, dot, dot. This is much longer than just this little list here. If I hover it over it, you can see it keeps flashing up on the screen. Here's all the various, and it only stays for a little while, so as I'm talking, it disappears. I'll try to get it to come back. But anyway, there we go. There's all the various file extensions that we're considering to be part of audio and video files. If you know of another file extension that belongs there, well, then you're going to want to go ahead and add it to this, right? You're going to want to go ahead and say edit the file group properties, and then you would add, you'd say star. So anything, that's what star stands for, anything. Anything dot 123. Now that's not a good example. That's not an actual, not that I know of anyway, an actual audio or video file. But if it was, I would go ahead and just do that and then add it in. And actually, I apologize. I clicked in the wrong box. This is where we're going to exclude those. Up here is where we would want to include the star dot 123. Okay, and it is just what it sounds like. You're saying anything that has this name is an audio or video file that we want to include as part of this particular file group. Excluding would be, maybe we had star.aac. Maybe there was some particular name we wanted to exclude from it. We could do that in here under files to exclude. Now I'm going to cancel out of there. We're not going to modify that at all. But you'll see that we have the various types of files, and we can create our own custom one, right? We come over here and say create a new file group. We just go ahead and give our own random group based upon, maybe our own customized, we just don't want to let these particular file types get onto a particular folder. So I'm going to cancel out of there. Now that you understand what file groups are, if I came back to templates, you'll see here that we could do a template name. Just so it doesn't get mad, I'll put in demo, whether we want it active or passive. What groups do we want? Okay, you'll notice there is another way here that we could create a new file group. You could again choose, I'm sorry, I have to, see again, it gets mad if you don't start to fill things out. All right, so we'll say audio and video files. Again, I can choose about email notifications, event log notifications, running a command, or running a report. Now I'm going to cancel out of there. We're not going to actually create that. And then again, we have our file screens. This is where we would now, actually, this is where we would go if we want to truly implement this. Right? We pick our path. We say on our documents folder here, we want to truly block audio and video files. And create. And there you go. No audio or video files will be able to be stored into that documents directory. Now, there's another thing that we can do here, and that is if we want to create a file screen exception. And this is where we can go ahead and, again, say in that same documents folder, we might want to go ahead and create an exception, and this is where we'll go directly to our file groups and say, you know what, we said no audio or video files, but I might go ahead and say audio file exception. That's a bad name. You probably want to be more specific to type of audio file that, so how about we say like MP3 exception, or even just MP3s, quite frankly, right? We could just say MP3 files. And then we could go ahead and put in here star.mp3. Add that in, click OK, check that box, click OK. What we've now done is we've said, all right, no audio or video files are allowed in this folder except MP3s. We're going to let those. Now, one thing you have to always know is that the exceptions always override the default. Now, moving along here into storage reports management. This is where we can go ahead and schedule a new report task. Okay, so this is where you can pick the type of reports, or not the type, but the specific reports, I should say, that you want. Again, it's going to get mad if I don't type a name in, so I'll just type that in. Give it a scope. Include all folders that store the following kinds of data. Okay, so we can pick certain types of data. We could also add a specific folder. Okay, so we can specifically say the documents folder is what we want to create a report for. How do we want it delivered, right? Do we want it emailed, and who do we want it emailed to? And of course, it's getting mad at me because I don't have anything in here and there's no SMTP folder, so that's fine. Let me uncheck that box so that it doesn't bother me with that. And then I pick a schedule of how often do I want these reports to run. There's not a whole lot more to storage report management. Okay, it's just an issue of saying, and of course it's getting mad at me because as soon as you click on a tab, it wants you to do something. So we'll say fine, every Sunday. There, now it's happy. Bottom line here is when it comes down to storage reports is there are many different types of reports. Look at this, duplicate files. That's a cool one, right? Isn't that a great, way to waste a lot of disk space when you have multiple people saving the same file? Okay, now that may not be common when you have, one particular folder, but you might be looking at an entire volume, and each user might have their own folder on that volume. And each of those users might have a copy of the exact same file. That's a little ridiculous, isn't it? So there is actually a feature in Windows Server 2012 called dedupe, which can go through and actually eliminate those duplicates. All right. So basically, the idea here behind this is just being able to go ahead and look at these various reports of what's going on your system, on your file server, so that you can act on it and you can see and you can look at trends and recognize when you might run into a problem with disk space and things like that. I'm going to hit cancel because we didn't create anything that was usable there. If we look at classification management, and I'll expand that. Here we have our classification properties, okay, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. And again, I'm going to show you this on a real basic level. And I'm going to show you specifically for the purposes of creating what's eventually going to be a file management task, but it also can be used for actual access control as well, okay, through dynamic access control. So I'm going to create local property, and I'm going to just call this confidential. All right, just simply confidential. That's a property. I'm creating a new property essentially for the files on this server. And I'm going to say it's a yes or no type property. Okay, there's a lot of different types, but right now we're just going to call this yes or no, meaning it's kind of an on or an off. Either it is or is not confidential. And I click OK. Now I will tell you, nothing has been done, meaning I haven't accomplished anything. I just created a property. But now I need to go ahead and create a rule surrounding that property. So if I right click and say create classification rule, and why don't I call this confidential documents? Enable the rule. Again, we have to implement a scope here, so we're going to specifically go into our documents folder here. And then here's where we can go ahead and put in the actual classification. In other words, how does it become part of this confidential documents? How does this happen? Well, we're going to say that it's a content classifier, which you see it searches strings and regular expressions. We'll look for this. I'll show you. Choose the property that we want to assign to the files. We're going to assign that confidential property that we just created, right? I created the property. Now we're going to assign that property, and we're going to say that it's a yes. We're going to turn that property, we're going to turn that confidential property to yes. And when I configure the parameters here, this is where I will do a string expression, and the expression itself will be the word confidential. And then we want to know how many times does the word confidential appear. And we're going to say at least once. And we click OK. And then there's one other tab here real quick. I just want to talk about it briefly, this evaluation type. Notice here it says by default property values that have already been set are ignored during classification. If you want this rule to reevaluate existing property values, let me check the box. Okay, so what we're saying here is if we want to force this, if we want to force the reevaluation of any particular file that may have already had the confidential property type previously set, then we say go ahead and reevaluate. And then what do we want to do if there's a conflict? Overwrite it or aggregate the two together. And you'll notice that it says if it's a yes or no or ordered list, the value with the higher priority is selected. Okay, so if you're wondering, like with something like yes or no, how do you aggregate? You kind of can't aggregate. It'll do the higher value. I'm not going to worry about any of that really. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK just so that we can have our confidential documents classification rule put in place. Now I could go ahead and I can run the classification with all our rules, right? We can go ahead and run this classification if we want to say go now and check all the files and see what happens to them. But it wouldn't do any good for us to do that right now because, well, I don't have any files stored in there anyway. Okay, if I wanted to see this actually happen, then what do? I could jump over to my Explorer here, go into that documents folder, create a new, we'll say text document. We'll just call it demo doc. And then from there, I'm going to go ahead and put this is a confidential document. And I will close it and I will save it. If I look at the properties of this document, classification, okay, you'll see that there is this particular here, right? There's this confidential classification. Right now it has a value of none. Now I can specify it myself right here manually. What we're talking about here in FSRM is the idea of if I say go ahead and run this now, okay, go through and run it. Shouldn't take too long. Let me go ahead and jump back over here. Go to the Properties, Classification tab. You'll notice confidential has now been set to yes, automatically. Okay, that was done with the File Server Resource Manager. Now again, this is the kind of thing that we can, this is what's something called claims-based authentication or dynamic access control, to where we could now use this particular classification property as a way to control access. You can actually go in and set permissions based upon that particular property. But that, again, as I said in the beginning, is outside the scope of what we're doing here. So what is within the scope of what we're trying to do here is this file management tasks. This is the very last thing that we're going to talk about here. And actually, you know, I need to do one other thing before I go to my file management tasks. If I right click on classification rules, I should have showed you this. Configure classification schedule. Right? I showed you can run at a given time, like I can say, boom, run it right now. I could also create a schedule. And this, again, remember I promised you we'd be back to this tab. This was a tab that we saw in the original File Server Resource Manager options. This is where we can enable a fixed schedule that says on, you know, given particular day, a certain time, whatever, go ahead and check for classifications. Go ahead and run our classification rules on all of our documents to go ahead and see where they fit in. All right, so let's back out of there. We don't need to set that up. Now we can move on to file management tasks. If I create a new file management task, again, it'll get mad, so I'll just put in the word demo. The scope, we need to go ahead and put in a folder. For an action, the most typical as far as built in, there's two, or what looks like three, is you can either do something called a file expiration, you can do RMS encryption, or then there's custom. And that's why there's really two, and then the third one being custom if you want to create your own custom action. Okay, and again, that's getting a little more advanced than what we want to worry about right now. But let's do file expiration. This is a fairly typical one. Where do we want to send it? What's the expiration directory? So let's go to our C drive and actually let's make a new folder. And let's just call it expired docs. And click OK. We can choose if we want to have a notification go out. We can choose if we want a report to be created. And by the way, I wish these tabs were in a slightly different order, because the reality is condition is really the next item I would be looking at. In other words, we start off here with just a name, what folder or folders we want to look at, what do we want to do, What are the conditions is the next thing I'm thinking of. And for a condition, this is where I can go ahead and add, and I can say, if a file has the property of confidential, that is yes. Right? So we say that the confidential is equal to yes. Okay, that's the condition that needs to be made. We can also then take it a step further and say, it also had to be, let's say, a certain number of days since the file was created, certain number of days since the file was last modified, certain number of days since it was last accessed. Okay, so there's certain other things that we're doing here if we're going to be expiring. So what we're saying here is anything that is deemed confidential and it's been X number of days since, and I'm going to leave it at 0 because I'm going to attempt to make this happen, although like I said, it's a little tricky because, well, it's also fresh. I mean, if I came back tomorrow, it'd be a lot easier for me to show you, but we'll see if we can make it work. From there, again, a notification could go out, a report could be created, and we also could schedule when we want this file management task to go through. We could also run it continuously on new files. So I'm going to go ahead and just click OK. Oh, sorry, it got mad at me. Got to pick a day. Click OK. And then here we have this task. I could choose to run this task now, which I'm going to do. I'm going to say run it now. Boom, go. What I am hoping for, okay, this is what I'm hoping for. If I jump back over here into Explorer and go into my Documents folder, hey, look at that. It's now suddenly empty. And the reason it's empty is because over here in our expired docs folder, it's showing me from NYMem2, right? It creates a folder for the computer that it came from, the date and time. On my C drive, Documents folder, there is my demo doc. Now, why did it move it? It moved it because we already saw that it did fall under confidential, and I told it if the last time it was accessed was 0 days ago, okay, meaning basically there is no time limitation. If it, in this particular demonstration, it's just boom, do it now if it qualifies. All right, so that is what we can do with our file management tasks, and that is pretty much how you use the File Server Resource Manager. Okay? The idea, as we already saw, some of these things can be done manually on an individual file, folder, or sometimes volume basis. This gives us a centralized way to manage quotas, file screening, storage reports, classification, and file management tasks all in one location for the entire server, or in some cases, you can add additional servers and manage them all from one place. All right, so that's pretty much it. That's how FSRM works. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.